Picture this, a crowded subway car, the kind where you can barely breathe without bumping into someone. It's rush hour, and the air is thick with the hum of chatter, the screech of brakes, and that unmistakable city energy. In the middle of it all, there's a young black teenager, maybe 17, standing near the back, earbuds in, hoodie up, just trying to get through the ride like everyone else. His name's Jamal, and he's got this quiet confidence about him, the kind you don't notice unless you're really looking. Across from him, a pregnant white woman struggles to keep her balance as the train jerks forward. She's gripping the pole, her face tired, maybe a little anxious. No one else seems to care, they're all glued to their phones or staring out the window, pretending not to see her. But Jamal, he notices. And without a second thought, he stands up, taps her shoulder, and offers her his seat. It's a small moment, the kind that happens every day, right? But what happens next? It's not just a thank you. It's a note, a folded piece of paper she slips into his hand as she sits down. And when Jamal unfolds it later, his whole world turns upside down. Let me take you back to that subway car for a second, because this moment, this one simple act of kindness, is where everything starts. Jamal's just a regular kid from Brooklyn, raised by his mom in a neighborhood where you learn quick to keep your head down and your hustle up. He's not looking for attention, not trying to be a hero. He's got his own problems, school's a grind, his mom's working double shifts at the hospital, and he's saving every penny from his part-time job at a local diner to help out. But there's something about Jamal that makes you root for him. Maybe it's the way he carries himself, like he's got a spark of something bigger inside, even if he doesn't know it yet. That day on the train, he's just trying to get to his shift on time, maybe catch a quick nap before he clocks in. But when he sees that woman struggling, something in him clicks. He doesn't overthink it, he just acts. He pulls out his earbuds, steps forward, and says, "You can take my seat." Simple words, but they set off a chain reaction nobody could have predicted. Now, let's talk about her, the woman. Her name's Claire, and she's not just any passenger. She's in her early 30s, blonde hair pulled back in a messy bun, dressed in a coat that looks a little too nice for this gritty subway line. There's a heaviness to her, though, like she's carrying more than just the baby she's expecting. Her eyes are tired, her smile faint when she thanks Jamal and takes the seat. She's polite, but there's something else there, something guarded. Maybe it's the way her hands fidget with the strap of her bag, or how she keeps glancing around, like she's checking for someone. Jamal doesn't think much of it at first. He's just glad she's sitting down, and he goes back to his spot, leaning against the wall, music playing low in his ears. But as the train pulls into the next station, Claire does something unexpected. She reaches into her bag, pulls out a small piece of paper, and scribbles something fast. Then, as she gets up to leave, she presses it into Jamal's hand and says, "You're a good kid. Don't lose this." Her voice is quiet, almost urgent, and before Jamal can even respond, she's gone, disappearing into the crowd. What's in that note? That's the question burning in Jamal's mind as he stands there, the paper warm in his palm. He doesn't open it right away. He's not sure why, maybe it's the weird vibe Claire gave off, or maybe he's just too caught up in the moment. He stuffs it in his pocket and heads to work, figuring he'll check it later. But the whole way to the diner, he can't shake the feeling that something big just happened. It's like the air around him has shifted, like the universe is whispering, "Pay attention, Jamal. This is important." And let me tell you, he's right to feel that way. Because when he finally unfolds that note, it's not just a thank you or some random scribble. It's a message that could change everything, not just for him, but for his whole family. Now, let's zoom out for a minute. This story isn't just about a kid and a note. It's about how one small choice, one moment of doing the right thing, can ripple out in ways you never expect. Jamal's life isn't easy. He's grown up in a world where people don't always give you a chance, where you've got to prove yourself every single day. But he's got heart, and that's what makes this moment on the train so special. He didn't have to give up his seat. He could have kept his head down like everyone else. But he didn't. And Claire, she's not just a random stranger either. There's something going on with her, something bigger than a crowded subway ride. That note she gave Jamal, it's not just words on paper. It's a key, a clue, a door to something neither of them could have seen coming. As Jamal gets to the diner, the note's still in his pocket, heavy like it's got a weight all its own. He's behind the counter, flipping burgers, pouring coffee, trying to focus on the usual chaos of the evening rush. But his mind keeps drifting back to that moment on the train. Who was that woman? Why'd she look so nervous? And what's with the note? He's itching to read it, but the diner's packed, and his boss is barking orders. Every time he thinks he's got a second to sneak a look, someone calls for a refill or a side of fries. It's driving him crazy, this little piece of paper burning a hole in his pocket. Finally, during a quick break, he slips into the back, pulls it out, and unfolds it. His heart's pounding as he reads the words scrawled in hurried handwriting. And when he does, his breath catches. This isn't just a thank you note. It's something else entirely, something that makes his hands shake and his mind race with questions. What does it say? I know you're dying to know, and trust me, I want to tell you. But here's the thing, this story's just getting started. Jamal's about to step into something way bigger than he ever imagined, something that'll test everything he thought he knew about himself and the world around him. Was Claire just a grateful stranger? Or is there more to her story? Is that note a gift, a warning, or something else entirely? And what does it mean for a kid like Jamal, who's just trying to make it through the day? Hold on tight, because this is where things get wild. Stick around, and let's find out together what happens when one small act of kindness turns into a life-changing moment. Jamal stood in the cramped back room of the diner, the faint smell of grease and burnt coffee clinging to the air. The note was still in his hands, its edges already softening from how tightly he'd been gripping it. The words scrawled across it didn't make sense, not yet, at least. Meet me at the corner of 5th and Maple, tomorrow, 3 p.m. You're more than you know. No signature, no explanation, just those words in smudged blue ink, written like whoever penned them was in a hurry. Jamal's heart was still racing, his mind spinning with questions. Who was this woman, Claire? Why him? And what did she mean, more than you know? He shoved the note back into his pocket, his break almost over, but the weight of it seemed to grow heavier by the second. He couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't random, that somehow, this moment on the subway had been meant for him. Back at the counter, the diner was still buzzing. Regulars shouted orders, plates clattered, and the old jukebox in the corner played a scratchy Motown tune. Jamal went through the motions, wiping down the counter, refilling ketchup bottles, but his head wasn't in it. He kept replaying the subway ride. Claire's face, her nervous glances, the way her hand trembled just a little when she handed him the note. He'd seen plenty of people on the train before, all kinds of stories written in their eyes, but something about her stuck with him. She wasn't just tired or stressed, she was scared. And that note. It felt like a secret, one he wasn't sure he wanted to carry. But there was no ignoring it now. He glanced at the clock. His shift wouldn't end for another 3 hours, and already he was dreading the walk home, knowing he'd be turning those words over in his mind the whole way. Jamal's life wasn't the kind where mysteries just dropped into your lap. He grew up in a small apartment in Bed-Stuy, where the walls were thin and the neighbors were loud, but family was everything. His mom, Tanya, was the kind of woman who could make you laugh even on the worst days, but she was stretched thin, working long hours as a nurse. Jamal's dad wasn't around, hadn't been since he was a kid, and Tanya had been both parents ever since. She was tough, always pushing Jamal to be better than the world expects, but she worried about him, too. He could see it in the way she'd look at him when he left for school or work, like she was afraid the city might swallow him up. Jamal felt that pressure every day to make her proud, to prove he could rise above the odds stacked against him. School was okay, but he wasn't some straight-A kid. He was good with his hands, though, always fixing things around the apartment, and he had a knack for reading people. That's why Claire's nervousness had caught his eye. He knew what it looked like when someone was carrying something heavy. As the night dragged on, the diner started to empty out. Jamal's co-worker, Maria, a 20-something with a sharp laugh and a habit of sneaking him extra fries, noticed he was off. "Yo, Jamal, you good?" she asked, tossing a rag over her shoulder. "You look like you saw a ghost or something." He forced a smile, shrugging it off. "Just tired, you know." But Maria wasn't buying it. She leaned in, lowering her voice. "Come on, man, what's up? You've been weird since you got here. Jamal hesitated. He wasn't big on sharing, especially not something this strange. But Maria had this way of pulling stuff out of you, like an older sister you couldn't say no to. It's nothing, he said finally. Just, some lady on the subway gave me a weird note. Maria's eyes lit up. A note? Like, what kind? Love letter? Stalker vibes? Jamal laughed despite himself. Nah, nothing like that. It's just, cryptic, I guess. He didn't tell her what it said. He wasn't ready to share that yet, not until he figured out what it meant. When his shift finally ended, Jamal stepped out into the cool night air, the city alive with distant sirens and the hum of traffic. He pulled his hoodie up and started the long walk home, the note still tucked in his pocket. The streets were familiar, cracked sidewalks, neon signs flickering in shop windows, the occasional shout from a group of kids hanging out on a stoop. But tonight, everything felt different, like the world was holding its breath. He kept thinking about Claire. She didn't seem like she belonged on that subway, not with that fancy coat and the way she carried herself, like she was used to nicer things. But there was something else, too, something haunted in her eyes, like she was running from something. Or someone. Jamal's mind raced with possibilities. Was she in trouble? Was the note some kind of cry for help? Or was it something else entirely, something he couldn't even wrap his head around yet? Back at home, the apartment was quiet. His mom was still at work, her night shift not ending until early morning. Jamal kicked off his shoes and flopped onto the couch, the note burning a hole in his pocket again. He pulled it out, reading it one more time. Meet me at 5th and Maple, tomorrow, 3 p.m. You're more than you know. The words felt like a puzzle, each one heavy with meaning he couldn't quite grasp. He thought about not going. It could be a scam, right? Or something worse. He'd heard stories, people getting lured into bad situations, especially kids like him who didn't have much to their name. But then he thought about Claire's face, the way she'd looked at him, like she saw something in him no one else did. That wasn't fake. He was sure of it. Still, the idea of meeting a stranger at some random corner made his stomach twist. He wasn't a kid who went looking for trouble, but trouble seemed to have found him. He grabbed his phone and started searching for 5th and Maple. It wasn't far, just a few subway stops away, in a part of the city that was a little fancier than his neighborhood. Coffee shops with overpriced lattes, boutiques with clothes he couldn't afford, that kind of place. Why there? Why him? He thought about telling his mom, but he could already hear her voice, warning him to stay out of it, to keep his head down and focus on school. She'd be right, probably. But something about that note made him feel like this wasn't just about him anymore. It was bigger, like he'd stumbled into someone else's story. He set the note on the coffee table, staring at it like it might speak if he looked hard enough. Then he noticed something he hadn't before, a tiny smudge on the corner of the paper, like a fingerprint. It was faint, but it looked deliberate, like someone had pressed their thumb there on purpose. Was it Claire's? Or someone else's? The next morning, Jamal woke up with the note still on his mind. He hadn't slept much, his dreams a jumble of subway cars and faceless strangers. His mom was already up, sipping coffee at the kitchen table, her scrubs wrinkled from the long night. You look tired, baby, she said, her voice soft but sharp with concern. Everything okay? Jamal nodded, not trusting himself to say more. He wanted to tell her about the note, about Claire, about the meeting at 3 p.m., but the words stuck in his throat. Tanya had enough to worry about without him adding some mystery to her plate. Just work, he said, grabbing a piece of toast. She gave him that mom look, the one that said she knew he wasn't telling her everything, but she let it go. You be careful out there, okay, she said as he headed for the door. Always, he replied, but his voice sounded hollow, even to him. By the time 2:30 rolled around, Jamal was standing at the subway station, his hands stuffed in his pockets, the note folded tight in his fist. He decided to go to 5th and Maple, even though every instinct told him to stay away. It wasn't just curiosity driving him, it was something deeper, like a pull he couldn't explain. The train ride felt endless, each stop ratcheting up the tension in his chest. What was he walking into? Was Claire going to be there, waiting for him? Or was this some kind of setup? As the train pulled into the station near 5th and Maple, Jamal took a deep breath, his heart pounding like it was trying to break free. He stepped onto the platform, the note still in his hand, and headed toward the corner where everything would change. Whatever was waiting for him, he was about to find out. Jamal stepped out of the subway station, the late afternoon sun cutting through the city's haze and casting long shadows on the pavement. The corner of 5th and Maple was alive with the hum of upscale Brooklyn, people sipping overpriced coffee at outdoor cafes, a street vendor selling artisanal pretzels, and the occasional dog walker with a purebred pup. It was a far cry from his neighborhood, where the streets felt rawer, more real. He scanned the crowd, his pulse quickening, looking for Claire's blonde bun or that fancy coat. The note was still in his hand, crumpled now from how much he'd been fidgeting with it. "Meet me at the corner of 5th and Maple, tomorrow, 3 p.m. You're more than you know." Those words echoed in his head, each one heavier than the last. He checked his phone, 2:58 p.m. 2 minutes to go, and no sign of her. His stomach twisted. Was this a mistake? Was she even coming? He leaned against a street lamp, trying to look casual, but his eyes darted around, searching for anything that felt off. Across the street, a man in a dark suit lingered by a newsstand, flipping through a magazine but not really reading it. Jamal noticed him right away, something about the way he kept glancing up, his eyes sharp, like he was watching the crowd. Was he watching Jamal? The thought sent a chill down his spine, but he shook it off. He was being paranoid, right? Just a kid from Bed-Stuy, caught up in his own head. Still, he couldn't ignore the prickle at the back of his neck, that instinct you develop when you grow up in a place where you always have to watch your back. He shifted his weight, slipping the note into his pocket, and decided to give Claire 5 more minutes before bailing. But then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw her, or at least, he thought he did. A woman with blonde hair, wearing a scarf now instead of that coat, was hurrying down the sidewalk, her head down like she didn't want to be noticed. Jamal's heart jumped. He took a step forward, ready to call out, but something stopped him. She wasn't alone. A guy, tall and broad-shouldered, was walking a few steps behind her, his pace matching hers a little too perfectly. Jamal froze, his mind racing. Was this guy following her? Or was he with her? Claire, if it was even her, didn't look back, but her steps were quick, almost panicked. She turned into a small cafe, the kind with big glass windows and overpriced pastries in the display case. The guy followed, keeping his distance but never letting her out of his sight. Jamal's instincts screamed at him to walk away, to forget the note and pretend this never happened. But he couldn't. That note, those words, they felt like a hook in his chest, pulling him forward. He crossed the street, dodging a cyclist, and slipped into the cafe, keeping his hoodie up and his head low. Inside, the air smelled like espresso and fresh bread, and the place was packed with people tapping away on laptops or chatting over cappuccinos. Claire was at a table in the corner, her back to the wall, her eyes scanning the room. The guy who'd followed her was at the counter now, ordering something, but his body was angled so he could keep her in his peripheral vision. Jamal slid into a booth a few tables away, close enough to watch but far enough to blend in. He pulled out his phone, pretending to scroll, but his attention was locked on Claire. She looked different today, more tense, if that was possible. Her hands were wrapped around a mug, but she wasn't drinking. She kept glancing at her watch, then at the door, like she was waiting for someone. Was it him? Jamal's throat felt dry. He didn't know what he was supposed to do, walk up and say, "Hey, I got your note." What if this was some kind of setup? He thought about his mom again, her voice echoing in his head, "Be careful out there." He was trying, but careful didn't seem to cover whatever this was. He glanced at the guy at the counter, who was now stirring sugar into his coffee, his movements slow and deliberate. Something about him felt wrong, like he was too calm, too controlled. Jamal's gut told him this wasn't just some random dude. Meanwhile, back in Bed-Stuy, Maria was wiping down tables at the diner, her mind still on Jamal. She'd known him for a year now, ever since he started working weekends to help his mom with the bills. He was a good kid, quiet but sharp, always quick with a joke when things got slow. But last night, he'd been different, distracted, like something was eating at him. That note he mentioned. It was weird, sure, But Maria had seen enough to know that weird could mean trouble. She'd grown up in the same neighborhood, and she knew how fast things could spiral when you got mixed up in something you didn't understand. She thought about texting him, just to check in, but her phone buzzed first. It was her cousin, Louis, a cop who worked the precinct a few blocks away. Heard anything about a woman asking kids for favors on the subway? His text read. Got a report about some sketchy stuff going on. Maria's stomach dropped. She didn't know details, but her mind went straight to Jamal and that note. She texted back, maybe. Talk later, and shoved her phone in her pocket, her worry growing. Back at the cafe, Jamal was still watching Claire, trying to piece together what was going on. She hadn't noticed him yet, or if she had, she wasn't letting on. He was starting to think he'd made a mistake coming here when she suddenly looked up, her eyes locking on someone at the door. Jamal followed her gaze. A woman, maybe in her 40s, with short dark hair and a sharp blazer, walked in, her steps purposeful. She headed straight for Claire's table and sat down without a word. Jamal couldn't hear what they were saying, but their body language told a story. Claire's shoulders stiffened, and the other woman leaned in, her voice low but intense. They weren't friends, that much was clear. Jamal strained to catch a word or two, but the cafe's noise drowned them out. He glanced at the guy at the counter, who was now sitting at a table nearby, his coffee untouched, his eyes flicking between Claire and the new woman. Whoever he was part of this, and Jamal was starting to feel like he'd walked into a movie where he didn't know the script. The note in his pocket felt heavier than ever. He wanted to pull it out, read it again, see if he'd missed something, but he didn't dare. Not with that guy so close. Instead, he thought back to the subway, trying to remember every detail about Claire. The way she'd hesitated before handing him the note, the way her voice had sounded almost desperate when she said, "Don't lose this." What was she trying to tell him? And why him? He was just a kid who gave up his seat, nothing special, nothing worth chasing. But the words "you're more than you know" kept circling in his mind, like a riddle he was supposed to solve. He thought about his mom again, about how she always said he had a purpose, something bigger than the struggles they faced. Was this it? Or was he just getting in over his head? Across town, Tanya was finishing her shift at the hospital, her feet aching and her mind heavy with worry. Jamal had been quiet this morning, too quiet, and she knew her son well enough to know when something was up. She'd raised him to be cautious, to stay out of trouble, but she also knew he had a heart that sometimes led him into places he shouldn't go. She checked her phone, hoping for a text from him, but there was nothing. She thought about calling, but it was barely 3:15, she didn't want to nag. Still, something felt off, like a storm was brewing and she couldn't see it yet. She sent him a quick text, "Home soon. You okay?" and hoped he'd answer before her shift ended. Back at the cafe, the conversation between Claire and the woman in the blazer was getting heated. Claire's hands were shaking now, and she pushed her mug away, her voice rising just enough for Jamal to catch a few words. "Not safe and can't keep running." His heart skipped a beat. Running from what? Or who? He glanced at the guy with the coffee, who was now typing something on his phone, his face unreadable. Jamal's mind raced with possibilities. Was Claire in danger? Was the note a call for help, or something else entirely? He didn't know what to do, but one thing was clear, he wasn't leaving this cafe until he had answers. The clock on the wall ticked closer to 3:30, and the tension in the air was thicker than ever. Whatever was happening, Jamal was in deep now, and there was no turning back. The cafe felt smaller now, the air thick with the hum of conversations and the clink of coffee cups, but all Jamal could hear was his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. He sat in his booth, his phone forgotten in his hand, his eyes locked on Claire and the woman in the blazer. Their conversation was a quiet storm, Claire's face pale, her hands gripping the edge of the table, while the other woman's voice stayed low but sharp, cutting through the noise like a blade. Jamal caught fragments of their words, "Time's running out and you don't understand," and each one twisted the knot in his stomach tighter. The guy at the nearby table, the one with the untouched coffee, was still there, his phone now face down, his eyes flicking between Claire and the door. Jamal's instincts screamed that something was about to go down, something big, and he was sitting right in the middle of it. The note in his pocket felt like it was burning, those words, "You're more than you know," echoing in his mind like a warning he couldn't decode. He shifted in his seat, trying to stay invisible, but his hands were sweaty, and his leg wouldn't stop bouncing under the table. He kept thinking about the subway, that moment when Claire had pressed the note into his hand. Her eyes had been so intense, like she was trusting him with something she couldn't say out loud. But what? And why him? He was just a kid from Bed-Stuy, not some detective or hero. Yet here he was, caught in a web he didn't understand, watching a scene unfold that felt like it belonged in a movie, not his life. He glanced at the clock on the cafe wall, 3:45 p.m. He'd been here longer than he planned, and every minute made him feel more like he was trespassing in someone else's story. But walking away wasn't an option anymore. Not after what he'd heard, not with that note still unanswered. Claire's voice rose just enough for Jamal to catch another phrase, "It's not about me anymore." Her words were shaky, almost desperate, and the woman in the blazer leaned closer, her expression hard. "You can't keep this up, Claire," she said, loud enough for Jamal to hear clearly this time. "They're closing in." Who was they? Jamal's mind raced. The guy with the coffee? Someone else? He scanned the cafe again, his eyes landing on a new figure, a woman standing just outside the glass window, her phone to her ear, her gaze fixed on Claire's table. She was dressed casually, jeans and a leather jacket, but there was something about her posture, too alert, too focused. Jamal's heart sank. This wasn't just about Claire and the blazer woman anymore. There were too many players, too many eyes, and he was starting to feel like he was being watched too. Back in Bed-Stuy, Maria was pacing the diner's back room, her phone clutched in her hand. Lewis's text about sketchy stuff on the subway had her on edge, and Jamal still hadn't answered her messages. She'd sent him 3 since her shift started, just casual check-ins, but the silence was gnawing at her. She knew Jamal could handle himself, he was smart, street-savvy, but that note he'd mentioned last night wasn't sitting right with her. She'd seen too many kids in the neighborhood get pulled into trouble over something that seemed small at first. She thought about calling Lewis, asking him to dig deeper, but what would she even say? "My coworker got a weird note from a lady on the train." It sounded ridiculous, but her gut told her it wasn't. She fired off another text to Jamal, "Yo, you good? Call me." Then she slipped her phone into her apron and headed back to the counter, her worry growing with every step. At the hospital, Tanya was finishing her rounds, her phone buzzing with a new text from Jamal, "I'm fine, Mom. Be home soon." It was short, typical Jamal, but something about it felt off. She stared at the screen, her thumb hovering over the call button. She'd always trusted her son, but the city had a way of testing that trust. She thought about the stories she heard at work, patients caught up in scams, debts, or worse. Jamal was a good kid, but good kids could still get hurt. She sent a quick reply, "Stay safe, baby. Love you." Then she pocketed her phone and headed to the break room, promising herself she'd talk to him when she got home. Whatever he was hiding, she'd get it out of him. She always did. Back at the cafe, the tension was suffocating. Claire was standing now, her chair scraping against the floor, her face flushed. "I did what I could," she said, her voice breaking. The woman in the blazer grabbed her arm, not hard but firm, and said something Jamal couldn't hear. Claire yanked her arm free and turned toward the door, her scarf slipping off her shoulder. That's when she saw him. Her eyes locked on Jamal's, and for a split second, the world seemed to stop. There was recognition in her gaze, but also something else, fear, maybe, or urgency. She took a step toward him, then stopped, her eyes flicking to the guy with the coffee. He was standing now too, his hand in his pocket, his posture tense. Jamal's breath caught. He wanted to move, to say something, but he was frozen, pinned by the weight of her stare. Before he could react, the woman in the leather jacket outside stepped into the cafe, her phone gone, her hands free. She moved fast, weaving through the tables, her eyes on Claire. Jamal's mind screamed at him to do something, but what? He didn't even know what was happening. Was Claire in danger? Was he? The note in his pocket felt like a bomb now, ticking down to something he couldn't predict. Claire grabbed her bag, her movements jerky, and headed for the door. The blazer woman followed, her voice low and insistent. The guy with the coffee was right behind them, his steps silent but deliberate. Jamal's heart was pounding so hard he thought it might burst. He stood up, his legs shaky, and started toward the door, keeping his distance but unable to look away. Whatever was happening, he was part of it now, whether he wanted to be or not. Outside, the street was busier now, the late afternoon crowd thickening. Claire was moving fast, her scarf trailing behind her, the blazer woman and the coffee guy close on her heels. The woman in the leather jacket was there too, keeping pace but staying a few steps back. Jamal followed, his hoodie up, his hands stuffed in his pockets to hide how much they were shaking. He didn't know what he was doing, only that he couldn't let Claire out of his sight. Not after that look she gave him, not after the note. The words "you're more than you know" kept looping in his head, each one a puzzle piece that didn't fit. He thought about his mom, about Maria, about how he should be anywhere but here, chasing a stranger through the streets of Brooklyn. But he couldn't stop. Not now. As they turned a corner, Claire ducked into an alley, her steps faltering like she was running out of steam. The blazer woman and the coffee guy followed, their movements too coordinated, too practiced. Jamal hesitated at the mouth of the alley, his breath coming in short gasps. The leather jacket woman was there too, pausing just long enough to glance back at him. Her eyes narrowed, like she was sizing him up, and then she disappeared into the alley after the others. Jamal's mind was a mess: fear, curiosity, and something else he couldn't name, all fighting for control. He took a step forward, then another, the note still in his pocket, its weight pulling him deeper into the unknown. The alley was narrow, shadowed, the kind of place where secrets lived. He could hear voices now, low and urgent, but he couldn't make out the words. His phone buzzed in his pocket, probably Maria or his mom, but he ignored it. He was too close to whatever this was, too close to answers he wasn't sure he wanted. The voices grew louder, a shout cutting through the air, and Jamal's heart stopped. Something was happening, something big, and he was about to walk right into it. The alley was darker than Jamal expected, the late afternoon sun barely reaching its narrow walls, which were lined with overflowing dumpsters and graffiti-tagged bricks. The voices ahead were sharp now, a mix of Claire's panicked tone and the blazer woman's clipped, urgent words. Jamal's sneakers scuffed against the pavement as he crept closer, his heart hammering so loud he was sure they'd hear it. He stayed low, ducking behind a stack of cardboard boxes, his breath shallow. The note in his pocket felt like a live wire, buzzing with the weight of those words, "You're more than you know." He still didn't understand what they meant, but the scene unfolding in front of him was making one thing clear: this wasn't just about a kind gesture on a subway anymore. This was something dangerous, something that could swallow him whole if he wasn't careful. The shout he'd heard moments ago echoed in his mind, and as he peered around the boxes, he saw Claire backed against the wall, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear. The blazer woman was in front of her, gesturing wildly, while the coffee guy stood a few feet away, his hand still in his pocket, his posture too calm for the chaos around him. But it was the woman in the leather jacket who made Jamal's blood run cold. She was holding something now, a small black object that glinted in the dim light. Was that a gun? Jamal's stomach lurched, and he pressed himself tighter against the boxes, his mind screaming at him to run. He wasn't supposed to be here, wasn't supposed to see this. He was just a kid who gave up his seat on a train, not some hero chasing down trouble in a Brooklyn alley. But his feet wouldn't move. He couldn't tear his eyes away from Claire, whose hands were raised now, her voice trembling as she said, "Please, I didn't tell him anything." Tell who? Him. Jamal's throat went dry. Was she talking about him? The note, the meeting, the way she'd looked at him in the cafe, it all started to feel like a puzzle snapping together, but the picture it formed was one he didn't want to see. The leather jacket woman stepped closer, her voice low and steady. "You're out of time, Claire. Hand it over." Hand what over? Jamal's mind raced, trying to piece it together, but before he could, the blazer woman spun around, her eyes locking on the shadows where he was hiding. "Who's there?" she snapped, her voice cutting through the alley like a knife. Jamal froze, his heart stopping for a beat. He held his breath, praying the shadows were enough to hide him, but the blazer woman took a step toward the boxes, her eyes narrowing. The coffee guy moved too, his hand finally coming out of his pocket, revealing a phone, not a gun, thank God, but he was typing something fast, his face unreadable. Claire's eyes darted toward the boxes, and for a split second, Jamal thought she saw him. Her expression shifted, not just fear now, but something like regret. "Don't," she said, her voice barely a whisper, and Jamal wasn't sure if she was talking to him or the others. The leather jacket woman turned, her grip tightening on whatever she was holding, and Jamal's instincts kicked in. He ducked lower, his hands shaking as he fumbled for his phone. He needed to get out of here, needed to call someone, Maria, his mom, anyone, but his fingers felt like they belonged to someone else, clumsy and slow. Then came the twist that turned his world upside down. From the far end of the alley, another figure appeared, a boy, maybe a year or two older than Jamal, with a familiar slouch and a hoodie pulled low over his face. He moved with purpose, his steps quick but quiet, and as he got closer, Jamal's breath caught. He knew that walk, that silhouette. It was Dion, his cousin, the one who'd been in and out of trouble since they were kids. Dion, who'd disappeared 6 months ago after a fight with his dad, leaving nothing but a vague text about needing space. What was he doing here? Jamal's mind reeled, the pieces of this puzzle scattering all over again. Dion didn't see him, didn't even glance his way, but he walked straight toward Claire and the others, his hands in his pockets, his posture tense but confident. "You didn't think I'd let you do this alone, did you?" he said, his voice low, directed at Claire. She flinched, her eyes wide, but there was a flicker of relief in her expression, like she'd been waiting for him. Jamal's head was spinning. Dion knew Claire. How? Why? His cousin had always been the wild card in the family, the one who'd sneak out at night, who'd talk big about making it out of bed Stewie with some grand hustle. But this was different. This wasn't just Dion getting into trouble, this was something bigger, something that had Claire backed against a wall and 3 strangers circling her like wolves. The blazer woman's face hardened at Dion's arrival, and she took a step back, her hand reaching into her bag. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," she said, her voice cold. The leather jacket woman raised her hand, the black object now clearly a gun, and Jamal's heart stopped. He wanted to shout, to run, to do something, but his body wouldn't move. Dion didn't flinch, though. He raised his hands, slow and deliberate, and said, "You don't want to do that. Not here." His voice was steady, but Jamal could hear the edge in it, the same edge he'd heard when they were kids and Dion was talking his way out of a fight. The coffee guy was on the move now, circling around to block the alley's entrance, his phone still in his hand. Jamal's mind was a storm of questions. How was Dion involved? Was he helping Claire, or was he part of whatever had her so scared? And what did this have to do with the note? Jamal's hand brushed against his pocket, the crumpled paper still there, its words now feeling like a trap. "You're more than you know." Did Dion know about the note? Was he the reason Claire had given it to him? The thought hit Jamal like a punch. Had his cousin dragged him into this, whatever this was? He thought about the last time he'd seen Dion, at a family barbecue, his cousin laughing but distant, like he was already halfway out the door. Now here he was, in an alley with a gun pointed at him, and Jamal was stuck in the shadows, watching it all unfold. Back at the diner, Maria was losing it. Jamal still hadn't answered her texts, and Lewis had just called, his voice tight. "We got a tip about some activity near 5th and Maple," he'd said. "Something about a woman and a kid. You sure your friend's okay?" Maria's heart sank. She didn't know where Jamal was, but 5th and Maple wasn't far, and that note he'd mentioned was starting to feel like a red flag. She grabbed her jacket, told her boss she was taking her break, and headed out, her phone already dialing Jamal's number. It went straight to voicemail. "Come on, Jamal," she muttered, her steps quickening as she headed for the subway. She didn't know what she'd find, but she wasn't about to let him deal with this alone. At the hospital, Tanya's shift was finally over, but her unease hadn't lifted. Jamal's text had been too short, too vague, and now he wasn't picking up. She called again, her fingers tight around her phone, and when it went to voicemail, she felt a cold dread settle in her chest. She thought about Dion, how he'd vanished without a word, and now Jamal was acting strange too. She grabbed her bag and headed for the door, her mind made up. She was going home, and if Jamal wasn't there, she'd find him. No matter what. In the alley, the tension was a live wire. Dion was still talking, his voice low and steady, trying to calm the leather jacket woman, but her gun didn't waver. Claire was silent now, her eyes flicking between Dion and the others, her hands trembling. The blazer woman pulled something from her bag, a small envelope, sealed tight, and held it out to Claire. "This is your last chance," she said, her voice like ice. Claire shook her head, tears in her eyes, and that's when Jamal heard it, a low hum, like a car engine, coming from the other end of the alley. Headlights flashed, blinding in the dim light, and the sound of tires on gravel grew louder. Someone was coming, and from the way everyone froze, it wasn't good. Jamal's heart was in his throat, his body screaming to run, but he couldn't. Not with Dion there, not with Claire's life on the line, not with that note still burning in his pocket. Whatever was about to happen, he was in it now, and there was no way out. The alley was a pressure cooker, the headlights slicing through the darkness like a spotlight on a stage where everything was about to explode. Jamal crouched behind the boxes, his breath shallow, his heart pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat. The hum of the approaching car grew louder, tires crunching on the gravel, and the beam of light pinned Claire, Dion, the blazer woman, and the leather jacket woman in a stark glow. The coffee guy was still blocking the alley's entrance, his phone now back in his hand, his eyes darting between the car and the group. Claire's face was a mask of fear, her hands trembling as she clutched her bag. Dion stood firm, his voice steady but tight as he said, "Put the gun down. You don't want this to get messy." The leather jacket woman's grip on her weapon didn't waver, but her eyes flicked toward the car, uncertainty creeping into her stance. The blazer woman held the envelope out again, her voice sharp. "Claire, take it. End this now." Jamal's mind was a whirlwind. What was in that envelope? Why was Dion here? And what did any of this have to do with him? The note in his pocket felt like it was screaming, its words, "You're more than you know," burning hotter than ever. The car stopped, its engine idling, and the driver's door swung open. A man stepped out, older, maybe in his 50s, with grey hair and a suit that looked expensive even in the dim light. He moved with the kind of confidence that made everyone pause, even the leather jacket woman, who lowered her gun just a fraction. "Enough," he said, his voice calm but commanding, like he was used to being obeyed. Claire's eyes widened, and she took a step back, her breath hitching. "You weren't supposed to be here," she whispered, her voice breaking. The man ignored her, his gaze shifting to Dion. "You've done well, kid," he said, and Jamal's heart sank. Dion. Done well? His cousin's face was unreadable, but there was a flicker of something, guilt, maybe, in his eyes. Jamal's stomach twisted. Was Dion working with this guy? Had he been part of this all along? The blazer woman stepped forward, holding out the envelope. "It's all here," she said, her voice steady now. "Everything you asked for." The man took it, flipping it open to glance inside, and Jamal caught a glimpse of papers, documents, maybe, or photos. He couldn't tell from where he was hiding, but whatever it was, it made Claire's face crumple. "You don't understand what you're doing," she said, her voice rising. "This isn't just about me." The man's eyes narrowed, and he stepped closer, his presence filling the alley. "You made your choice, Claire. You could have walked away." Dion shifted, his hands still raised, and for the first time, he looked at Claire with something like apology. "I didn't have a choice either," he said quietly. Jamal's head spun. His cousin, his own blood, was in this deep, and he hadn't even known. Then it all happened so fast. The leather jacket woman raised her gun again, her voice sharp. "No more games. Hand over the drive, Claire." A drive. Jamal's mind raced back to the note, to the subway, to Claire's trembling hands. Was that what this was about? Some kind of data, some secret she was carrying? Claire shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "I don't have it," she said, her voice barely audible. "I gave it to him." Him? Jamal's heart stopped. She meant him. The note wasn't just a message, it was a signal, a handoff. He reached into his pocket, his fingers brushing the crumpled paper, and that's when he felt it, a tiny, hard object taped to the back of the note. A USB drive, small enough to miss if you weren't looking. His breath caught. Claire had slipped him more than words on that subway. She'd given him something dangerous, something these people were willing to kill for. The man in the suit turned, his eyes scanning the alley, and Jamal shrank back, his pulse racing. Find him, he said, his voice cold. The coffee guy moved first, his steps quick as he headed toward the boxes where Jamal was hiding. Panic surged through him, and he scrambled backward, knocking over a crate with a loud crash. All eyes turned toward him. There, the blazer woman shouted, and before Jamal could think, he was running, his sneakers pounding against the pavement, the USB drive and note clutched in his fist. Dion's voice rang out, "Jamal, wait." And that stopped him for a split second, just long enough to see his cousin's face, torn between loyalty and something darker. But there was no time to process it. The leather jacket woman was moving now, her gun raised, and the coffee guy was closing in. Jamal darted out of the alley, his lungs burning as he sprinted into the crowded street. The chaos of Fifth and Maple swallowed him, people shouting, horns blaring, but he could hear footsteps behind him, too close. He didn't know where to go, only that he had to keep moving. The USB drive felt like a grenade in his hand, its weight pulling him deeper into a world he didn't understand. He thought of his mom, of Maria, of how he'd promised to be careful. And now here he was, running for his life because of a moment of kindness on a subway. He turned a corner, his breath ragged, and ducked into a doorway, his hands shaking as he pulled out his phone. He needed help, needed someone to make sense of this. He dialed Maria, his voice barely a whisper when she picked up. "Maria, I'm in trouble. Fifth and Maple. Please." Back in the alley, the scene was unraveling. Claire was sobbing now, her hands covering her face as the man in the suit grabbed her arm. "You thought you could play us," he said, his voice low and dangerous. Dion stepped forward, his hands still raised. "She didn't tell him anything," he said, his voice steady but pleading. "He's just a kid." The man's eyes narrowed, and he shoved Claire toward the car. "Then we'll deal with the kid." The leather jacket woman and the coffee guy were already gone, chasing Jamal, but Dion stayed, his face a mask of conflict. He'd been working with these people, helping Claire for months, but he hadn't known it would come to this. He thought about Jamal, his little cousin, always looking up to him, and his stomach twisted. He'd dragged him into this without even meaning to. Maria was already on her way, her heart pounding as she pushed through the subway crowd, Lewis's number on speed dial. She'd called him the second Jamal's voice came through, shaky and scared. "He's at Fifth and Maple," she told Lewis, her voice tight. "Something's wrong. Hurry." Lewis didn't ask questions, he knew Maria's instincts were sharp, and a kid like Jamal didn't call for help unless it was bad. He was already in his patrol car, lights flashing, weaving through Brooklyn traffic toward Fifth and Maple. Tanya was on her way too, her gut telling her something was wrong with her son. She didn't know the details, but she could feel it, like a mother always does. Jamal crouched in the doorway, his breath coming in gasps, the USB drive still in his hand. He peeled back the tape on the note, staring at the tiny device. Whatever was on it, it was worth all this, Claire's fear, Dion's betrayal, the gun in that woman's hand. He thought about tossing it, leaving it for them to find, but something stopped him. Claire's words on the subway, "Don't lose this," rang in his ears. He didn't know her story, but he knew she'd trusted him for a reason. He slipped the drive into his pocket and peeked out, the street still chaotic but no sign of his pursuers. Then he heard it, a low whistle, sharp and deliberate. He turned, and there was Dion, standing at the end of the block, his face pale. "Jamal," he called, his voice low. "Give it to me. I can fix this." And then the final twist hit. Dion wasn't alone. Behind him, stepping out of the shadows, was Tanya, her eyes wide with fear and anger. "Jamal," she shouted, her voice cutting through the noise. She'd found him, tracked him down through some mother's instinct, but now she was here, in the middle of this mess. Dion froze, his hands raised, and for a moment, the world held its breath. Jamal's heart sank. His mom, his cousin, the drive, the chase, it was all colliding, and he didn't know who to trust anymore. The sound of sirens was closing in, and the leather jacket woman's voice echoed from somewhere nearby. "He's here," she shouted. Jamal gripped the drive, his eyes locked on his mom's, and realized the choice was his. Hand it over, or run. But whatever he chose, nothing would ever be the same. The street was a blur of noise and light, the sirens growing louder as Jamal stood frozen in the doorway, the USB drive clutched in his sweaty palm. His mom, Tanya, was just feet away, her face a mix of fear and fury, her eyes locked on him like she could pull him to safety with her stare alone. Dion stood between them, his hands still raised, his expression torn, like he was caught in a tug-of-war between loyalty and something darker. The leather jacket woman's shout, "He's here!" cut through the air, and Jamal's heart pounded so hard he thought it might burst. The note, the drive, Claire, Dion, this whole messed-up chase, it was all crashing down, and he had seconds to decide what to do. Run, and keep his mom out of this. Or hand over the drive, and maybe end it. But end what? He still didn't know what was on that drive, only that it was worth enough to have a gun pointed at Claire, to have Dion tangled up in something he couldn't explain, to have his whole world turned upside down over one kind act on a subway. Tanya took a step forward, her voice shaking but firm. "Jamal, baby, come to me. Right now." Her words were a lifeline, pulling him back to the kid he was before all this, her son, not some hero or pawn in a game he didn't understand. But Dion's voice cut in, low and urgent. "Jamal, give me the drive. I can fix this. They won't hurt you." Jamal's eyes flicked to his cousin, the cousin who'd taught him how to ride a bike, who'd snuck him candy when Tanya wasn't looking. But this Dion was different, his face shadowed with secrets. Jamal's hand tightened around the drive. "Why, Dion?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why'd you drag me into this?" Dion's jaw clenched, and for a moment, he looked like he might break. "I didn't mean to," he said. "I swear, I didn't know it'd be you." Before Jamal could respond, the leather jacket woman appeared at the end of the block, her gun lowered but her eyes sharp. The coffee guy was with her, his phone still in hand, and behind them, the man in the suit stepped out of the alley, Claire at his side, her face pale and tear-streaked. The sirens were close now, flashing lights painting the street red and blue. Jamal's heart raced. This was it, the moment everything would either fall apart or come together. He looked at his mom, then at Dion, then at the drive in his hand. He didn't know what was on it, but he knew it was the key to everything. "Jamal!" Tanya shouted, her voice breaking. "Don't you dare do anything stupid." But he was already moving, stepping out of the doorway, his hands raised, the drive held out like a white flag. The man in the suit's eyes locked on him, and a slow smile spread across his face. "Smart kid," he said, his voice smooth as he stepped forward. "Hand it over, and this all goes away." Jamal's stomach twisted. He didn't trust that smile, didn't trust any of them. But the sirens were so close now, and he could hear tires screeching nearby. He glanced at Claire, who shook her head, her eyes pleading. "Don't," she mouthed, but the man in the suit grabbed her arm, silencing her. Dion took a step toward Jamal, his voice low. "Give it to me, man. I'll make sure they leave you alone." But Jamal was done trusting Dion. He'd been betrayed enough for one day. He took a deep breath, his eyes on his mom, and tossed the drive to the ground, right in the middle of the street. The world seemed to freeze. The leather jacket woman lunged for it, but before she could reach it, a patrol car screeched to a stop, and Louis, Maria's cousin, jumped out, his hand on his holster. "Nobody move," he shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. Maria was right behind him, her eyes wide as she spotted Jamal. "Oh my God, you idiot," she yelled, running toward him. Tanya was there too, pushing past Dion to grab Jamal, pulling him into a hug so tight it hurt. "What were you thinking?" she whispered, her voice thick with tears. But Jamal's eyes were on the drive, lying in the street, and the man in the suit, who was backing away now, his calm demeanor cracking. The leather jacket woman and the coffee guy froze, their hands raised, as more cops poured out of a second car. Louis moved fast, picking up the drive and slipping it into an evidence bag. "Everybody stay where you are," he said, his eyes scanning the group. Claire was crying silently, her hands covering her face, and Dion looked like he wanted to disappear. The man in the suit tried to slip away, but Louis was on him, cuffing him before he could take another step. "You're not going anywhere," Louis said, his voice hard. Jamal's head was spinning, the weight of the last hour crashing down on him. He just wanted to help, to do the right thing, and now he was here, his mom clinging to him, his cousin staring at the ground, and a tiny USB drive in a cop's hands that could have gotten him killed. As the cops sorted out the scene, Claire finally spoke, her voice shaky but clear. "It's evidence," she said, pointing at the drive. "Proof of what they've been doing, money laundering, fraud, all of it." She looked at Jamal, her eyes full of gratitude and guilt. "I didn't mean to pull you into this. I saw you on the train, and you were kind. I thought you'd keep it safe." Jamal's throat tightened. He didn't know what to say. He'd been scared, angry, confused, but now he just felt tired. Tanya squeezed his shoulder, her eyes blazing as she looked at Claire. "You put my son in danger," she said, her voice low and fierce. Claire nodded, tears spilling over. "I know. I'm sorry." Dion was cuffed now too, his head down as Louis led him to the patrol car. Jamal wanted to hate him, but all he felt was a hollow ache. Dion had been working with Claire, trying to get out from under the man in the suit's thumb, but he'd made bad choices, pulled Jamal into a mess he didn't understand. "I didn't know it'd be you," Dion said again, his voice barely audible as he passed by. Jamal didn't respond. He couldn't. Not yet. Later, at the precinct, the story came together. The USB drive held records of a massive financial scam, run by the man in the suit, a businessman named Victor Crane. Claire had been his assistant, caught up in his world until she couldn't stomach it anymore. She'd been trying to get the evidence to the authorities, but Victor's people were watching her every move. The note and the drive were her last desperate attempt to get it out, and Jamal had been her unwitting courier. Dion had been helping her, thinking he could play both sides, but he'd underestimated how deep he was in. The blazer woman, the leather jacket woman, the coffee guy, they were all part of Victor's network, trying to keep the evidence from getting out. Jamal sat in the precinct's waiting room, his mom's arm around him, Maria pacing nearby. Louis came over, his face softer now. "You did good, kid," he said, holding up the evidence bag with the drive. "This is gonna put some bad people away for a long time." Jamal nodded, but he didn't feel like a hero. He felt like a kid who just wanted to help a stranger and ended up in over his head. Tanya kissed his forehead, her voice fierce. "You're never doing anything like this again, you hear me?" Jamal managed a small smile. "Yes, Weeks later, things started to settle. Dion was out on bail, facing charges but cooperating with the cops to reduce his sentence. He and Jamal hadn't talked much, there was too much hurt there, too many questions, but Tanya was working on getting him help, maybe a lawyer. Claire disappeared after giving her statement, probably starting over somewhere new. The drive had done its job. Victor Crane was indicted, his empire crumbling in the headlines. Jamal went back to school, back to the diner, but he wasn't the same. That moment on the subway, that one small act of kindness, had changed him. He kept the note, not the drive, but those words, "You're more than you know," as a reminder. Not of the danger, but of what he could do when he chose to act. As he walked home one evening, the Brooklyn streets alive with their usual chaos, Jamal thought about his mom, about Maria, about how they'd been there when it counted. He thought about Claire, about Dion, about how everyone's choices ripple out, touching lives in ways you can't predict. He wasn't a hero, wasn't some big-shot detective, but he'd made a difference, even if it scared him half to death. And as he passed the subway station where it all started, he smiled a little. Sometimes, the smallest things, a seat on a train, a note in a stranger's hand, could change everything. That was the real takeaway. Kindness matters, but it's never as simple as it seems.